He raised his glass to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the company I built from scratch, and in the soft gold light of the chandeliers, I saw it clearly. He leaned in and kissed Sabrina on the cheek, not in secret, not in shame, but as if I had never existed. The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Laughter spilled over champagne flutes like nothing had happened, like the last decade of my life was just background noise. I didn't clap. I didn't flinch. I just held my glass a little tighter and smiled. Not because I forgave them, but because I knew something they didn't. In every story, the spotlight falls on the ones who speak the loudest, pose the prettiest, and claim the stage. But the real writer, she stands in the shadows patient, prepared, and painfully quiet. When the final act comes, it's not about who gets the applause. It's about who owns the script when the lights go out. Before I take you deeper into this story, tell me in the comments, have you ever been erased from your success and watched others claim it like you were never there? I want to hear your story. You are not alone. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated, then prove them wrong. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, betrayal, and the kind of revenge no one sees coming, but everyone feels. Because sometimes the best revenge is building something they can never take credit for. They called it a celebration. 10 years of Monroe Langley interiors, 10 years of accolades, glowing magazine spreads, and million-dollar projects. 10 years of late nights, tight deadlines, and 1,000 little sacrifices that no one but me seemed to remember. The ballroom shimmered in soft gold, the kind of luxury Sabrina liked, opulent but Instagram-friendly. The champagne was Veuve Clicquot. The floral arrangements, ranunculus and white roses, her favorites, not mine. Even the music had her fingerprints on it, jazzy, curated, shallow. I stood near the edge of the room, invisible in a black silk dress I'd designed myself 3 years ago for a gala no one remembered. I watched Ethan glide through the crowd with Sabrina on his arm, his hand low on her back in a way that used to be reserved for me. Their laughter blended so seamlessly that it felt rehearsed. People looked at them and saw a power couple. They looked at me and saw no one. Sabrina had always been magnetic. In college, she was the girl who turned heads in the library without ever opening a book. She had a talent for performance. Even back then, she knew exactly how to cry at the right moment, how to laugh like a champagne glass shattering. And Ethan. He was the kind of man who'd always been two things at once, charming and calculating. He made you feel like you were the only person in the room until you weren't. Together, they looked unstoppable. Until you noticed the quiet at the edge of the spotlight. Me. I was the architect of the firm. The systems, the workflows, the structure that was my doing. They built on top of what I laid down and called it theirs. A waiter passed by. I took another sip of champagne. It tasted like betrayal with a citrus twist. Then came the toast. Ethan stepped up to the podium, Sabrina just behind him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I watched the way her fingers curled, slightly possessive. 10 years ago, he began, voice smooth as aged bourbon. We started with a dream and a warehouse that leaked every time it rained. Laughter. I didn't laugh. He continued. Through highs and lows, wins and setbacks, one thing has never changed: this team, this family. And I have to especially thank Sabrina Langley. Her creativity, her drive, her vision. They're what pushed us forward when things got hard. Applause. And then he said it. I couldn't have done this without her. There was no mention of me. Not my name. Not even the vague nod of our co-founder. Just silence. I took another sip. This time it scorched. Sabrina stepped up, added a few breathy words about resilience, reinvention, and the future. Her voice wavered just enough to seem touched. People clapped harder. And then Ethan turned toward me, smiling like a man offering peace. He walked over. Camera flashes danced around him. He extended a small envelope. My name was on it. Isabel. Just a formality, he said gently. The board thought it was best if transitions happened smoothly. I opened it. Effective immediately, I was being removed from my seat on the board of directors. Voluntary resignation, of course, pre-signed from a document dated 6 months ago, the one I'd signed during our last equity reshuffle. The one he'd said was just to simplify legal filings. I looked up. His face was calm, rehearsed. I glanced at Sabrina. She didn't look away. She smiled. I said nothing, just folded the letter back, placed it neatly on the tray of a passing waiter, and walked toward the terrace. Outside, the cold night air kissed my skin. The city lights below looked like tiny fires flickering without promise. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there for a long time, listening to the muffled music inside the clinking glasses, the celebration of a theft no one would name. And in that silence, I remembered something my mother once told me. Let them dance. Because when the music stops, the ones who built the floor are the only ones left standing. The next morning, I was gone. I left the condo, packed only what I'd bought with my own money. No notes, no arguments, no scene. I didn't return to the office. I didn't check emails. They assumed I was broken. That's the thing about people like Ethan and Sabrina. They confuse silence with defeat, but silence in my world is preparation. For weeks, I disappeared. I moved into a small loft in the West Loop, modest but mine. No one knew where I'd gone. But I watched them. Quietly. The company's Instagram feed changed tone. More inspirational, more collaborative. They started naming Sabrina as Chief Creative Officer, something we'd never formalized. Client quotes began featuring her name instead of mine. Awards I'd earned were recaptioned with team effort. They didn't just erase me. They rewrote the story, made it theirs. And I let them. Because while they were busy curating their fiction, I was collecting facts. The original brand trademark still in my name. The source files for our most iconic projects stored in a private encrypted drive that only I could access. The strategic partnerships. Relationships I had built, maintained, nurtured. They had the spotlight, but I had the keys. And as for the board, the same board that voted me out without a second thought, they were about to receive an offer they couldn't ignore from someone they'd long underestimated. But that comes later. For now, let's just say when you try to bury a woman in silence, you'd better pray she doesn't know how to grow things in the dark. Has someone ever erased you from something you helped build? Share your story in the comments. I read everyone. You are not invisible here. Like this video if you've ever had to start over, not because you failed, but because they feared your strength. And subscribe if you believe quiet revenge is still revenge. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that lasts. They never said it out loud. Not once. But you can tell when people decide you're no longer necessary. It happens slowly like erosion, a gentle hollowing of presence. You stop being introduced in meetings. Your name disappears from email threads. You speak and people nod, polite, distracted, already moving on. But the moment they need something signed, you're suddenly remembered. I used to think it was just growing pains. We had started Monroe Langley Interiors with nothing but vision boards, IKEA desks, and coffee we couldn't afford. I didn't expect gratitude every day. I didn't want it. But I thought, maybe some kind of truth would remain between us. I was wrong. It started with the smallest things. The first time I noticed it was during a press interview. Sabrina was doing a feature for a local magazine. I had helped design the showroom they were filming in. She wore a cream blazer and spoke with practiced warmth. The article hit the stands a week later. Sabrina Langley, the creative force behind Chicago's fastest-growing design brand. I remember the headline more than the content. Not once did she mention me. Not once did Ethan. I asked him about it that night over dinner. He barely looked up from his phone. They probably just ran out of room. Funny how the room always seems to run out right before your name appears. We used to be close, the three of us. Sabrina was my roommate in college. We met in a design elective, both of us broke tired and unsure. She couldn't draw to save her life, but she had ideas. And I had the hands to build them. We laughed a lot back then. Shared rent ramen late night dreams about someday having a studio with tall windows and high ceilings. I remember once in the dead of winter our heat went out. We huddled under one giant blanket and whispered ideas until we fell asleep. We were 22. We had nothing. Except for each other. I introduced her to Ethan. He was the TA in our architecture class. Sharp, funny, always smelled like cedarwood and ambition. Sabrina flirted first, but he only ever looked at me, or so I thought. We married at 26, and when Sabrina asked if she could join our new business venture, it felt like a natural circle completing itself. 3 friends, 1 vision. I handled back-end operations budgets, workflows, and legal filings. Sabrina became our brand face. And Ethan. He moved smoothly between us, equal parts strategist and showman. It worked until we started to succeed. That's when the cracks widened. Sabrina began traveling more for networking. Ethan started working later. They both stopped checking designs with me first. The final proof wasn't a confrontation. It was a photograph. 6 months before the gala, a client sent me a thank you note attaching a candid shot from an awards dinner I hadn't attended. In it, Sabrina's hand rested on Ethan's thigh under the table, barely visible, casual, intimate. I stared at the image for a long time. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I already had. Somewhere deep in my bones I'd known for years. Not the details, but the direction. You can feel when a story is shifting, when you're no longer the protagonist. I thought about confronting them. But what would I say? What did I notice that I hurt? Sabrina would twist it, make it about insecurity. Ethan would apologize coolly, vaguely in that way men do when they already believe they're justified. So instead, I did what I always did. I worked. I shored up vendor contracts. I audited design files. I created a secure digital vault, something only I could access. I reviewed my original ownership stake and quietly had my attorney confirm a few things. No threats, no war, just quiet architecture. Let them call me cold. Let them write me out. I was building something stronger than a narrative. I was building a foundation. It was around this time that they started calling me rigid. Isabel doesn't get the new creative directions, Sabrina would whisper in meetings, her voice sweetened with performative concern. Ethan stopped pushing back. He started echoing her. She just doesn't see the bigger picture anymore, he told the board during a quarterly review. I sat there 3 chairs away, smiling. Let them believe I was slow to adapt. Let them underestimate the quiet. Because while they were trading power plays and positioning themselves for influence, they forgot one thing: I wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. I was documenting everything. I never raised my voice, but I noticed every change of signature, every modification to our equity agreement, every NDA. Sabrina forced new hires to sign. She was consolidating influence, not just in the company, in my marriage. I'd see them sometimes, standing too close, laughing like people who share something they're not supposed to. At first I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe we were all just tired, distant. But one night after Ethan came home late again, I looked at his collar and found a single strand of hair that wasn't mine. Blonde, curled, smelled like her. I didn't ask questions. I poured myself a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and began backing up files. They always say betrayal starts with lies, but sometimes it starts with familiarity. They get used to you not reacting. They mistake your grace for weakness. They forget you were always the one holding the blueprint. They rewrite the script thinking they've won, not realizing you've already drafted the ending. They think they've replaced you, erased you. But here's the thing: you can only erase someone if they were ever really written in. I was never part of their story. Not really. Not the one they wanted to tell the world. So I became something else. Not the co-founder. Not the wife. not the friend. I became the storm, the silence before the fall, the name they would regret forgetting. Have you ever let someone believe they won, while quietly preparing for the moment they realized they hadn't? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. Like this video if you know what it's like to be underestimated, until you turn the page. Subscribe if you believe the most powerful revenge stories aren't about rage. They're about memory and the long game. Because I wasn't just waiting, I was building. And they had no idea what was coming. They thought I'd disappear. That once they'd stripped me of titles of seating charts of photo credits and speaking roles, I'd fade like an old logo, something nostalgic, outdated, best forgotten. But they misunderstood what I was made of. I wasn't paper. I was brick. I stayed quiet. For weeks. Didn't call anyone. Didn't post. Didn't defend myself. And that silence, it drove them mad. People like Ethan and Sabrina thrive on control of perception of conversation. When you don't show up to the fight, they lose their narrative. I moved out of our penthouse with less than a dozen boxes. I took only what belonged to me: my laptop, my journals, my original sketchbooks, the wedding photo we never hung. It was raining that day. Fitting. But I didn't use an umbrella. I wanted to feel the weight of it, let it soak through, remind me I was still here. My new apartment was a top-floor walk-up in the West Loop, exposed brick narrow windows, and an old elevator that groaned like it hated working. But it was mine. No memories in the walls, no betrayal in the floors, just space and quiet. The first thing I did was pull out the original incorporation papers, the ones Ethan never looked at, the ones Sabrina had rolled her eyes at back in 2013, saying, "Can't we just use legal Zoom like everyone else?" I had insisted on doing it the long way, the right way. And because of that, something crucial had slipped their minds. I was the one who registered our trademark. Not Ethan, not the company, me. My full name, Isabel Arden Monroe, owner of the brand, owner of the name. They could repackage it, repost it, recolor it, but they couldn't claim it. Not legally. And that was just the beginning. I started digging. Not for revenge, not yet, but for roots, for everything I had planted and buried and protected while they smiled for the cameras. There was the original design for the Langley lounge chair, the one that got us featured in Architectural Digest 3 years ago. That design was drafted in my bedroom on a sleepless night after Ethan forgot our anniversary. The proportions, the materials, the curve of the wood, every inch was mine. I pulled up the files, exported them, watermarked them. Then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, Gloria Tran. She had been our very first supplier, back before Sabrina convinced Ethan to scale up and go glossy. Gloria answered on the second ring. "Isabel," she said, "I thought you—" "I didn't vanish," I said. "I just stepped back." She was quiet. Then she said, "I've been waiting for this call." That week I made 7 more calls, all to the people I had brought into the company: vendors, architects, consultants, freelancers. Every one of them had quietly noticed the shift, the way my name had disappeared, the sudden shift in tone, the way Monroe Langley had turned from elegant to corporate glossy. "I thought you left," one of them told me. "No," I said. "I was erased." "That's different." I wasn't asking for pity. I was offering something better. A return to the kind of work that mattered. Quietly, deliberately, I began laying the foundation for something new. Not a rival firm, not a cheap replica, but a reclamation, a space where the soul hadn't been filtered out for press releases and brand deals. Meanwhile, Ethan and Sabrina basked. They made headlines. They opened a second studio in Miami. They did interviews where they talked about modern minimalism and post-Isabel clarity. Yes, they said that. Verbatim. They didn't mention me. But they couldn't stop referencing me. And that I found was delicious. Because even as they tried to define themselves by my absence, I was rewriting myself in spaces they no longer knew how to access. By month 2, I'd hired a lawyer. A quiet one, discreet, brilliant. Her name was Lydia Marks. She specialized in intellectual property and contract reversals. When I showed her the documents, trademark filings, archived emails, prototype sketches, she leaned back in her chair, smiled, and said, "Tell me, Ms. Monroe, do you want this to be loud? Or do you want it to last?" I looked her dead in the eye. "I want it to echo." She nodded. Then we began with silence. What they didn't realize was how many fingerprints they had left behind. Every pitch deck with my signature still on it. Every award submission cites me as the lead designer. Every interview where they credited me for vision. They had built a castle, but they used my bricks. And when you build something on someone else's foundation, you'd better hope they never come back with a sledgehammer. But I wasn't here to destroy. I was here to reclaim. While Lydia worked her side, I worked mine. I drafted the framework for my new company. Not flashy, not loud, but intentional. It would bear my mother's maiden name, Arden Studio. Simple, quiet, rooted. And it would feature the kinds of pieces that had once made Monroe Langley respected, not viral. I posted nothing, told no one. But word spread. First a message from a former intern. I heard a rumor. "Please let me know if it's true. I'd give anything to work for you again." Then a DM from a luxury hotel client. "Are you consulting privately now? We'd love to discuss." And finally, a quiet email from a former board member. Subject line: coffee. No body text. Just that. I smiled. They were nervous. Good. Back in their world, the cracks had started. Their new vision line was falling flat. Clients missed the warmth, the detail, the humanity. Sabrina's publicist had started ghosting reporters. Ethan's TEDx talk was poorly received. And in a leaked internal memo, one I shouldn't have seen, but there was a note. "We need to figure out how to recapture Isabel's tone." They didn't even realize how often they used my name like a spell, hoping it would conjure the magic back. But the magic wasn't gone. It had just moved. One night, I lit a single candle on my windowsill and opened the balcony door. The wind was cold, but my tea was warm, and the city below buzzed like a secret I was about to tell. On my laptop screen, the final draft of my lawsuit blinked, ready for Lydia's submission. And next to it, the landing page for Arden Studio quietly went live. No ads, no announcements. Just this: "Elegance is not in the noise, it's in the structure beneath it. I am." My initials. Stamped. Undeniable. Have you ever been replaced only to realize you were the one holding the real power all along? Share your quiet comeback story in the comments. You never know who else needs to hear it. Like this video if you've ever let them underestimate you, and then built something they couldn't touch. Subscribe for more stories about slow revenge, elegant rebuilds, and the kind of justice that doesn't need a spotlight. Just patience and truth. Because the thing about foundations is, if you lay them right, they'll outlast everything built on top of them. There's something sacred about a curve. Not the kind you see in logos or architectural facades, but the curve of a line drawn at 3 a.m. when your bones ache and your breath fogs the cold edge of the desk lamp. I remember that night, 3 winters ago. Ethan had gone to bed angry after a client dinner, where I'd corrected him publicly about a materials quote. Sabrina had stayed behind at the venue. She said she needed to network a bit longer. I returned home, peeled off my heels, and went straight to the workroom. And I sketched. Something fluid. Something honest. A chair with a single line of walnut bent into the shape of a falling leaf. A seat that held you without caging you. I named it the Kepler. It was never meant to impress, just to be understood. That sketch lived in my drawer for nearly a year, until Ethan found it. He said he'd accidentally opened the wrong folder, but when the Kepler showed up in our product launch 6 months later under a different name, the Langley Curve, I knew better. They changed just enough to make it seem new, added brass feet, polished the wood to a false gloss, claimed Sabrina had dreamt it up on a napkin during a trip to Milan. The press ate it up, design blogs called it an instant icon, and I said nothing. At the time, I thought silence meant love, but now silence was currency, and it was time to spend it. Lydia, my attorney, tapped her pen once on the table. You say this was your design? I pulled out the original file, time-stamped. Then a scanned image of my handwritten sketch complete with coffee stain in the top left corner and the smudge of mascara from the night I nearly cried into it. Then the early prototype specs sent from my email to a former manufacturer in upstate New York. Lydia leaned back. They built a bestseller off this. I nodded and took full credit. She smiled. Let's give them a chance to correct the record. We didn't start with court, we started with courtesy. A cease and desist letter, professionally worded, firm but reasonable, sent directly to Monroe Langley's legal department and CC'd to Ethan and Sabrina's inboxes. Attached were the sketches, the emails, and the prototype specs, all signed, all dated. I knew what would happen next. They'd panic, then deny, then try to settle quietly. But I had no interest in settlements. I wanted something they couldn't bury, a reckoning. The press got wind of it 2 weeks later. Not from me, but from a freelance design writer who had once been fired by Sabrina for not understanding modern branding. She'd seen my sketch and recognized the original curve. Her headline was brutal. Did Monroe Langley steal its signature chair? Within 48 hours, the comments were flooded. Design students posted side-by-sides. Former employees came forward. And just like that, the cracks in their empire began to spread. Sabrina made a public statement. It's unfortunate that a former partner is attempting to discredit the brand over creative disagreements. The Langley curve is a collaborative piece and its origins are well documented. I watched the clip 3 times, zoomed in on her hands. They were shaking. Ethan for once stayed quiet. He knew. He knew the signature on that original design wasn't hers, wasn't his. It was mine. And this time I wasn't going to let them rewrite the ending. A week later, Lydia filed formal copyright infringement documents, and I filed something else, a request to revoke commercial use of the Monroe Langley name based on the original trademark registration which I still owned. They thought I was just coming for the chair. They didn't realize I was coming for the story. Then came the call. Blocked number, late at night. I let it go to voicemail. It was Ethan. Belle, we don't have to do this. This can still be resolved. Privately. I didn't reply. He called again the next day, this time with an apology rehearsed down to the breath. You were always the heart of the company. Let's find a way to make this right together. Together. Funny how people remember your value once their foundation starts to wobble. I texted back one word, lawyer. Meanwhile, Arden's studio was quietly growing. The first collection launched softly, a 5-piece line inspired by silence called The Things They Left Behind. The reception was immediate. Old clients reached out. Design blogs did features. One of the pieces, The Quiet Bench, was shortlisted for an industry award that Monroe Langley had submitted for and been rejected. I didn't crow about it. Didn't post captions like Sabrina used to. But I slept better. One morning I walked past the Monroe Langley flagship showroom. It had always been our Pride glass front open-plan signature scent wafting through minimalist displays. Except now something had changed. There were no customers. The once busy display window was empty, and taped crudely to the inside of the glass was a sign, temporarily closed for inventory recalibration. I stood there for a moment, took it in, let myself feel it. Not joy, not vengeance, just closure. They had tried to erase me, and now they were the ones fading. 2 days later, Sabrina showed up, not in person, but in a handwritten letter slipped under the door of Arden's studio. It was 4 pages long. The first 3 were denial. The last one, regret. She wrote, I always envied how you could stay calm in storms. I created storms just to feel seen. And now I'm tired. I folded the letter, filed it, and said nothing. Because here's the truth. They didn't just steal a design. They stole peace, time, space, And I took all of that back, inch by inch, name by name, chair by chair. Not with fire, not with revenge, but with patience, proof. And something they never understood. Silence is not weakness, it's preparation. Have you ever seen someone take credit for what you built? Tell your story in the comments below. You never know who else has lived the same silence. Like this video if you believe the truth doesn't need to scream. Subscribe for more stories about quiet justice, long memory, and the kind of strength that doesn't demand attention because it already owns the room. They claimed the chair, but the curve. The curve remembered me. The invitation came in a cream envelope thick with pretense. No note, no greeting. Just the seal of the Monroe Langley board is printed at the top of a single page. Special session, strategic realignment and founding membership, reinstatement discussion. I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, but it was exactly what I expected. Desperation never arrives loud. It wears expensive suits. It offers meetings. The room hadn't changed. Same frosted glass panels. Same smoked oak table. Same chilled carafes of lemon water sweating onto cork coasters. But something was different. The temperature. People didn't meet my eyes. Some looked embarrassed. One Henry, the CFO, offered a stiff nod like we were running into each other at a funeral. I sat where I used to sit, end of the table. Right beneath the art piece I commissioned years ago, a diptych in soft gray and brass titled, Structure Collapse. How fitting. Ethan arrived first. His tie was looser than usual. His smile tightened. Belle, he said like he meant it. Thank you for coming. I didn't respond, just looked at the man who once swore he'd build empires with me, and now couldn't build a sentence without rehearsing it first. Then Sabrina walked in, and she did what she always did. Performed. Oh, Isabel, she exclaimed, overly bright. You look radiant. I've missed our talks. I let the silence respond for me. We waited. The board assembled. Then Ethan stood. I think we can all agree, he began, that recent events have been turbulent. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. Ethan continued. But in that turbulence, we've been reminded of the core values that built this company and of the foundational vision that Isabel brought to it. We believe it's time to repair that legacy. He looked at me. Sabrina added, We'd like to offer you an executive creative seat. Full title, Restored Ownership. We believe the public would welcome a united front. A united front, spoken like people trying to steady a ship they set on fire. I leaned forward, slowly, calmly, and said, No. The room stilled. No. Sabrina repeated like she hadn't heard the word in years. No, I said again. But thank you for confirming that the company can't function without the person you tried to erase. Henry blinked. I don't want a seat at a table you once pulled out from under me, I continued. I built that table, and then I left. And now I'm building something better. Ethan started to speak. I raised my hand slightly. Let me finish, I said. I pulled a thin folder from my bag and placed it on the table. Inside, copies of the cease and desist, the copyright registration for the Kepler chair, trademark enforcement notices, and a digital forensic audit tracing my original designs across 15 Monroe Langley marketing campaigns. By my lawyer's estimate, I said you owe me for 7 years of intellectual property misuse. Retroactively. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had their attention. And that's not including damages from false representation, misattribution, and revenue gained from illegally marketed product lines. Sabrina's mouth parted. No words came. I could file all of this, publicly, tomorrow. Henry cleared his throat again. Isabel, surely we can reach a... I held up one finger. Unless... Now they leaned in. You do 3 things. First, I said you publicly acknowledge my role as co-founder and original creative lead. Full-page print placement in design authority and modern form. My byline. My words. Ethan nodded quickly. Second, you release all remaining equity under my name, plus an exit package of my choosing at market valuation. Sabrina frowned. That's a lot to ask, no. It's the bare minimum, I said. And third, now I smiled. You remove the name Langley from the company. The silence cracked. What Sabrina said, the gloss finally chipping from her tone. The brand was registered under Monroe Langley. As a unity, I said. But that unity doesn't exist anymore. Not legally, not ethically, not commercially. You can't, I can. And I have. The Monroe trademark was registered under me. Alone. The Langley edition came later and it was never formalized in your name. I stood. You took something from me, and now I've taken it back. They didn't vote. Not officially. But they knew. Knew the lawsuits would destroy their valuation. Knew the public would never forgive another scandal. Knew they didn't have a choice. Sabrina was the first to break. She gathered her purse and stood sharp and rattled. You always thought silence made you better than the rest of us. I turned to her. No. I thought silence made me safe. But now I know it made me dangerous. The press release went live a week later. Effective immediately, Monroe Langley Interiors will transition into Langley Form. Buried in the fine print was a simple sentence. We acknowledge and thank Isabel Monroe for her irreplaceable contributions. No fanfare, no apology, just a line. But I didn't need more. I already had everything I came for. I walked past their new showroom 2 weeks later. The sign had changed. Langley Form in slick lettering. No depth, no soul. Inside, Sabrina stood near a young couple gesturing too widely. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She didn't see me, but I saw her, and for once, I felt nothing. That evening, I opened a letter. From Modern Form. They were awarding the Quiet Bench their annual Design of the Year. They asked if I'd be open to a feature article, titled simply, The Woman Who Outlasted Her Silence. I accepted. Not for revenge, but for the record. Some things deserve to be written down. Have you ever walked back into a room where they never expected you to rise again? Tell me your comeback story. Leave it in the comments. Your voice belongs here. Like this video if you believe quiet doesn't mean powerless, it means prepared. Subscribe for more stories of patient justice, slow awakenings, and the kind of victory that doesn't need noise because it leaves echoes. They tried to bury me again, but they forgot I always leave roots. Some people self-destruct dramatically, shouting, throwing things, setting fire to their legacy just to watch others scramble for a hose. But not Sabrina. No, her collapse was slower, more elegant, almost beautiful, like a glass sculpture cracking from the inside out. You can't hear the shatter until it's already in pieces. I first heard whispers from a former assistant. She doesn't trust anyone anymore, the girl wrote in a midnight message. Every team pitch gets torn apart. Half the staff quit last week. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. What was happening wasn't my doing. I'd removed my name, my ideas, my vision. The implosion was entirely theirs. Sabrina began redesigning the brand in a panic. She replaced the Langley curve with a new line called Formless, a harsh name for a harsh shift. Gone were the warm tones, the soft walnut grains. Everything turned sterile, bleached white, steel, hard lines with no story. Reviews were brutal. One critic wrote, "The soul has left the room. It's a gallery of shapes, not a collection of design." And yet Sabrina kept pushing forward. She launched 3 more products in 6 months. None sold out. The showroom once flooded with light, and people now felt like a museum for a brand that used to matter. Meanwhile, Arden's studio was quietly becoming a whisper in the right rooms. We didn't go viral, we didn't chase trends, but somehow we always ended up on the right pages, in the right conversations. Elegant, honest, designed like it remembers something one editor wrote. I smiled when I read that, because that was the point. Arden didn't need to impress. It needed to remember, and people were starting to remember me. I was invited to speak on a panel in New York. Topic: The Long Game, Women Who Built, Lost, and Reclaimed. I hesitated. Then I said yes. The event was intimate, raw. No stage lights, no performance. Just a room of women seated in a circle, each carrying a story shaped by betrayal, ambition, and return. When it was my turn, I didn't talk about Ethan. I didn't mention Sabrina. I talked about silence. How can it be both a wound and a weapon? And how sometimes the most powerful comeback is simply staying. At the end, an audience member came up to me and said, "I left my firm last month. I've been terrified. But hearing you tonight, I'm not anymore." That stayed with me longer than any award. One morning I saw Ethan on the street. He didn't see me. He was alone, no driver, no staff. Just a reusable coffee cup and a scowl deep enough to fold his face. He looked smaller, not in stature, but for a purpose. I didn't feel vindicated. Just done. Some ghosts no longer haunt. They just pass by. Sabrina, though, she held on. To the bitterness. To the image. I heard she tried to relaunch Langley Forum as a consultancy. Tried to host a masterclass in brand building. 10 people signed up. 5 asked for refunds. Her Instagram turned quiet. The captions stopped sounding triumphant. Then a story leaked. She'd been served with a countersuit from a former intern for stolen credit on a campaign pitch. History, it seems, does repeat itself. One evening I received a package. No return address, no note. Inside a leather sketchbook. Old. Familiar. It was mine. The one I'd lost years ago during a trip to Italy, or thought I had. I flipped through the pages. In the back, scribbled in a handwriting, not my own, "You never needed us. We only needed to be near your fire." It wasn't signed, but I knew. And that was enough. Have you ever watched someone who wronged you unravel not with rage, but with silence? Share your moment of clarity in the comments. Sometimes the fall is quieter than the betrayal. Like this video, if you've ever walked away and watched everything that hurt you collapse behind you without lifting a finger. Subscribe for more stories about the kind of revenge that doesn't scream, it just survives longer. Because the truth is, you don't have to destroy someone to win, you just have to outlast their lies. And Sabrina's fall. It wasn't loud. It was the sound of everything hollow finally echoing. I used to think power was about being recognized. That was when people clapped, when magazines quoted you, when invitations arrived embossed in gold. It meant something real. But that night, standing under the soft white light of the American Design Guild's Winter Gala, I learned something else. Power isn't how many know your name, it's how few can rewrite your absence. I hadn't wanted to attend. The email had sat unread for 3 days before I opened it. "We are honored to present you with the Lifetime Contribution Award in Contemporary Design." I stared at the words like they were written in someone else's language. It had been 2 years since I last stood on a stage. 3, since Monroe Langley had erased me. But I wasn't afraid of the lights anymore. I had already walked through the dark and found my way out. The gala was held in a glass atrium wrapped in ivy and warm brass lighting. The kind of place Sabrina used to say was made for people like us. I arrived alone. No entourage, no photographer, just a slate gray dress and a quiet resolve that came from knowing I didn't need to prove anything anymore. When I stepped inside, the room quieted for a moment, not out of awe, not out of scandal, but recognition. That kind of silence is rare, and it says more than applause ever could. I stood at the edge of the room watching others float by in conversations. Designers I had once mentored. Critics who used to ignore my work until Sabrina rebranded it. Young interns who whispered my name like a rumor they didn't expect to be real. One woman approached me hesitantly, late 50s, eyes sharp. "You're Isabel Monroe, aren't you?" I nodded. She took a breath. "I was in your seminar 12 years ago. You said something that made me leave my agency." "What did I say?" "You said, If the room keeps shrinking to make you fit, build your walls. I smiled. I still believe that. She touched my hand lightly. Thank you. I run my firm now. All women. All bold. And then she was gone. Just like that, a seed planted years ago had bloomed in silence. The award presentation began late. They listed off names I barely recognized, projects wrapped in marble and buzzwords, panels filled with people more interested in presence than process, and then my name, for her quiet, radical impact on American design. A woman whose work shaped a generation of interiors, but more importantly, whose silence taught us the cost of exclusion. The applause was polite, measured, but I wasn't listening for volume, I was watching eyes, and every gaze in that room held something different than before. They weren't seeing me as a footnote anymore, they were seeing the author. I walked to the stage, didn't bring notes, didn't need them. Thank you, I began. For the silence. A few heads tilted, because silence is where I did my best work. When they took my name, my title, my seat, they left me with one thing they couldn't erase. Time. Time to remember what I loved, time to sketch without permission, time to design without an agenda. The room was quiet now. You don't have to make noise to make history, you just have to make something that endures. I paused. Monroe Langley no longer exists, but the people they tried to step over still do. Some of them are in this room, some are watching from studios late at night, and some are still believing they have to ask to belong. I looked out steady. You don't. And with that, I stepped down. No flourish, no bow, just stillness. Afterwards, people lined up to speak with me. A professor who once denied me tenure, a magazine editor who'd rejected 5 of my collections, a young woman with blue hair and tears in her eyes. You're the reason I stayed, she said. And suddenly it all felt worth it. Not because of validation, but because truth always circles back, even if it takes the long way. Back at the hotel that night, I poured myself a glass of water, sat by the window. The award sat on the desk unopened. Instead, I opened my sketchbook. Not to draw, just to look. Old designs. Corners of paper filled with ideas I once thought were too soft, too strange, too quiet. Now they felt like a map. Not of where I was going, but how far I'd already come. A week later, the profile dropped. The woman who refused to disappear. I didn't read it at first, didn't need to. But when I finally did, one paragraph stood out. She didn't reinvent herself. She simply reappeared, unbent, unbothered, and undeniably necessary. It felt strange being seen so clearly by someone I'd never met. But maybe that's what happens when you stop performing. People finally see who you were all along. I got a call from Arden's studio. We're redesigning the HQ entrance, my assistant said. Good, I said. What are you thinking? Well, the team voted. They want to name the central meeting room after you. I laughed softly. Why? There was a pause. Because it's where decisions happen, where direction begins, and because none of this would exist if you hadn't stayed standing when everything else collapsed. I didn't say anything, just let the silence sit with us both. They sent a photo a few days later, a glass panel etched with the words, "The Monroe Room." For those who stood when they were told to step aside. I saved it to my desktop, not to post, just to keep. Some trophies don't belong on shelves, they belong in your spine. Have you ever been told you were done only to discover that you were just beginning? Share your comeback story in the comments. Someone out there needs to read it right now. Like this video if you've ever felt the coldness of erasure and chose instead to rebuild. Subscribe for more stories of quiet power, thoughtful revenge, and women who outlasted what tried to bury them. Because in the end, the seat they took from me wasn't the one that mattered. I was always the architect. They were just passing through the lobby. The email subject line read simply, "Coffee from Ethan Langley." No apology, no context, just a time and a place. I stared at it for a full minute, then closed the laptop, Some wounds didn't bleed. They pulsed, quiet, predictable, and still very alive. For 2 weeks I didn't respond. Then one afternoon, in a moment I still can't explain, I typed, "Okay." Not because I forgave him, not because I missed him, but because I wanted to see what kind of man he became once the applause faded. We met at a small cafe tucked between bookstores and law offices, a place we used to pass on morning walks when Monroe Langley was still a daydream. He arrived first, always did, still wore navy, still wore control like cologne. But something had changed. His eyes didn't reach as far. His posture, though straight, lacked certainty. He stood when he saw me, not out of politeness, out of habit. "Belle," he said softly. I sat. "Why now?" I asked. He folded his hands carefully. "Because silence doesn't echo as long as I thought it would." I didn't reply. "You built something again. Something that mattered. And I—" He stopped himself. "I followed noise. Partnerships. Sabrina. Press. None of it filled the space you left." I stirred my tea slowly. "You want me to say I forgive you?" "No." He meant it. He wasn't here for absolution. He was here because he didn't recognize the man in the mirror anymore. "I thought taking credit would make me become something bigger," he said. "Instead, it made me smaller." I looked at him carefully. There was a tremble in his thumb. Once I loved that thumb, the way it rested on my wrist during tense meetings, the way it tapped my collarbone when he laughed in bed. That thumb now looked like it was asking to be still. "I read your gala speech," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Twice," he added. "Not because I wanted to remember you, but because I wanted to remember myself." That surprised me. He continued, "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" I sipped my tea. "Sometimes. But then I remember how tightly you held the pen, how small you made the margins. There wasn't room for me to write." He closed his eyes slowly. "You were always the structure. I was just trying to look like the architect." It was the first honest thing he'd said in years. We sat in silence. Not heavy, not painful, just final. Like two chapters realizing they belonged in the same book, but different endings. He reached into his coat pocket, placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "What is it?" "My resignation from Langley Forum. I'm selling the rest of my shares, moving to Portland, teaching." "Why show me?" He looked up. "Because you were the last person I lied to, and I didn't want the truth to start without you." I nodded. Didn't touch the paper. He stood finally, looked down at me. "Thank you," he said. I met his gaze one last time. "You didn't lose me, Ethan. You just didn't keep up." And with that he left. I didn't keep the paper, didn't frame it, didn't burn it. Just let it stay behind on the table. A footnote he had to carry. Closure, they say, is something you walk toward, but sometimes it comes when someone else finally stops following you. Has someone ever come back, not for forgiveness, but because they didn't recognize who they became without you? Tell me your moment of reckoning. Have you ever looked at the past and thought, "I'm not angry, I'm just done"? Like this video if you believe that not every goodbye needs to be dramatic. Subscribe for more stories where the revenge isn't loud but honest. Because sometimes the justice you need is watching them realize you were the only part that ever mattered. Because mirrors don't lie, and neither does distance. It started with a blank page, not in my sketchbook, not on a screen, but inside me. After all the awards, the speeches, the quiet vindications, there was still one design left to create. One no one would see, no press release, no product launch, no grand unveiling, just mine. I moved to a new studio, smaller. No skyline views, no sleek lobby, just a table, 3 windows, and silence. It was enough. Each morning I lit the same sandalwood candle. Each night I closed the same leather-bound journal. In between, I returned to a kind of making I had long abandoned design for no one, just feeling, just texture, just the whisper of what was to be built. They call it healing, but I think it was remembering. Remembering the woman who once designed in the corners of rented apartments, who scribbled ideas on receipts, who thought too softly to be noticed and too deeply to ever forget. This last design wasn't about furniture, it was about the foundation, a space that held every version of me. There was a curved bench echoing my first collection, a patch of raw wood unfinished on purpose, a mirror facing the morning light not for vanity, but to remind me to look, to see the woman who stayed. They invited me to exhibit it, called it deeply personal. I declined. It wasn't for sale. It wasn't for them. It was the home I had always promised myself I'd return to. And this time, I had the key. I kept adding to the room. Not because it was incomplete, but because I was. One morning I placed a brass bell in the corner. Not to be rung, just to remind myself that some silences deserve to be heard. I framed an old sketch, the one Ethan once laughed at. It was a messy, asymmetrical shelf I called Anchor. He said it looked unstable. I now saw strength in its imbalance. Then I added a low lamp, one I designed when I couldn't afford real wiring. The cord ran visibly along the wall. A reminder that not all things beautiful are hidden. Some days I didn't create. I just sat, watched the light shift from amber to ivory on the unfinished wood. I thought of my younger self crying in the stairwell of our first office when the first investor said no. Of the nights Sabrina stayed late not to help but to study me. Of the day Ethan called me replaceable. I kept all of it, not out of spite, but because even fractures are part of the foundation. One afternoon a knock came at the studio door. It was Celia, one of the interns I'd trained a decade ago. Now a creative director herself, she'd tracked me down. I wanted to ask, she said, what made you stay in the field after everything? I smiled, because I knew what I was building, even if no one else did. She looked around the studio, eyes softened. This is everything we hoped for. No, I said gently. This is everything I refuse to give up. She left behind a small gift, a fountain pen engraved with a single word, architect. I placed it near the window, right beside the mirror. Have you ever reclaimed a space that was once taken from you, mentally, emotionally, physically? Leave a comment about the moment you finally felt at home again inside your skin. Like this video if you've ever realized the thing they tried to take was never theirs to hold. Subscribe for stories about rebuilding, not for revenge but for peace, because the most important design isn't made of glass or wood or fabric, it's made of memory and the courage to live in it. Legacy used to be a word I feared. It sounded like something men carved into corner offices, or like something reserved for marble plaques and annual luncheons. But now I understand. A legacy isn't built by those who shout the loudest. It's built by those who keep going when the room forgets their name. A year passed. No fanfare. No headlines. And yet I was happier than I'd ever been. My mornings were quieter. But my work was stronger. I hosted workshops for young designers in the studio, no social media allowed. Just hand sketches and honest critique. Some came in with buzzwords, left with bruises, but returned with blueprints that finally breathed. I didn't teach fame. I taught form. I didn't talk about my fall. I talked about resilience. Because the most radical thing a woman like me could do was stay visible without needing to be seen. One evening, a young woman lingered after class. She looked no older than 24, brown curls tucked behind nervous ears. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her tote bag. "Would you read this?" she asked. It was an essay. About her mother, about being told she was too soft for architecture, about watching a woman design strength in silence. Halfway through, I stopped reading aloud. My throat caught. She whispered, "That essay's about you. I just changed the names." I looked up, eyes glassy. "It's not the words that moved me," I said. "It's the fact that you knew I'd understand." The last scene in this story isn't a boardroom. It's not a courtroom. Not even a gala. It's a late afternoon in autumn, golden light through wide glass panes. My studio is full of quiet voices, and one girl sketching in the corner with a kind of fire I recognize. She doesn't know yet how hard the world will try to shape her, but she will. And when she does, she'll remember this room, this bench, this silence, this woman who did not disappear. I don't need them to say I mattered. I know I did because the legacy isn't me. It's who kept designing after watching me refuse to stop. What do you want to leave behind, not as proof, but as permission for someone else to begin? Share the quiet legacy you're living. Like this video if you've ever built a life that no one clapped for, but you knew was worth it. Subscribe for stories about women who weren't loud, but unerasable. Because some legacies are not written in stone, they're lived. In corners, in silence, in courage. And that's more than enough.